Hey there guys, I just wanted to say that I already explained this a little bit in this full recording, but here is my spoiler-free review of Light of the Jedi, and for clarity, when I do these reviews I do it in 3 tiers, and I obviously, in my preamble, after you hear the sort of starting theme song and whatnot, I kind of allude to there being more spoilers than there were. In the actual recording, which is like an hour long, I decided to not include as many spoilers as I initially thought I was going to. So for full clarity, part 1, for the first 20 minutes or so, is me giving background information on the High Republic and my general view of the book. Then part 2 is about some of the characters I really liked, and then part 3 goes into a little bit of detail of what the Great Disaster actually is, which you find out in the first chapter or 2 in the book. And then I also give more information on the main antagonists of the book. But for clarity, this will not spoil anything at all for the whole of the Light of the Jedi. It just depends on how much information you want before reading the book yourself, if you're going to do it, which I really recommend you do. But I just want to record this preamble just to clarify, if you get to the second or third part of my review and you're a little bit like unsure how much I'm going to spoil, I do not spoil much at all. I just give some very vague details on some of the characters and then the Great Disaster and the antagonists, all of which you find out within the book within several chapters. So just want to flag that up before the theme music plays. Thank you as always for listening, guys, and I just want to make a note as well, which is all my patrons got access to this a day early. So all the information about my patreon.com/genuine chit-chat, that is all in the description and whatnot. So thanks for anyone checking out the Patreon. There's lots of free stuff on there as well. Thanks for listening to the book review, and yeah, I'll just get on with it. Cheers. Hello there and welcome to Star Wars Comics in Canon, your guide to the wider Star Wars canon through the comic book lens. And to take you on this journey, I'm your host, Mike Burton. And so brings a book review episode. So I don't think I'm going to be numbering these ones because, well, I don't know. I just think it's nicer if it just seems like a book review. I know I did the Master and Apprentice book review quite a while ago, and I just thought, well, instead of numbering these as episodes, I think they'll be like special episodes, kind of like the interview ones as well, which I've got a few planned down the road for those as well. Well, one not too far away actually in a couple of weeks, so I'm quite excited for that. And then there's another couple which should be around April, May sort of time too, so probably won't number those either, but I'll cross that bridge when we come to it. In case you want to check out my other book review, it was actually of the book Master and Apprentice. And the Master and Apprentice book review was episode 28. If you're listening on a podcast app or Spotify or such like on the feed of Comics in Motion, that was released in October 2020. So you can go back and find that. However, if you are listening on YouTube, you should be able to find it within the Star Wars Comics in Canon podcast playlist or the book review playlist that I've recently been put up as well. So it should be quite easy to find. But yeah, if you want to check it out, episode 28, I've named it. So guys, this is a spoiler-free review to begin with. So for clarity, I'm going to give everyone fair warning before I do any spoilers, but in case you didn't listen to my other book review, I do book reviews in a slightly different way to what other people do. I try to do them in 3 phases, so you can kind of decide how much you want to hear about the book. So this first phase is going to be background information, stuff that you find either on the blurb or just from seeing stuff online, like really not spoiler territory at all, just vague sort of my views on the book, as well as some little details and things and bits and pieces there. The second phase of the review is going to be more details about characters, about events, and getting into just a little bit more story detail and whatnot. Then the third phase is going to be, it's not going to completely spoil the book. I'm not going to reveal the ending of this book because I just don't want to be honest with you. It's only been out for like 2 months at the point of recording this, so I don't want to spoil the whole book, and I want people to go and read this because not only is Soule an incredible author and also this book's brilliant, but also I want to encourage people to go out and buy the thing. Either you listen to it on Audible or you buy it yourself or whatever. I don't want to spoil the ending, and especially because it's such a new book and things. Whereas Master and Apprentice, I think I did give the ending away-ish. I gave like a vague couple of sentences about it just in case. In this scenario, I'm not going to. I'll probably give up a detail up to a certain point, but I've just got a few footnotes. I'm going to kind of see how this really takes me. I haven't got an explicit plan aside from the 3 tiers of how much or how little I'm going to spoil things. So for full clarity, anyone listening, if you haven't read the book and you do intend to, I will give you fair warning before I start giving any plot details that are going to cause any problems in that sort of realm. But aside from that, let's get on to some of the background information about the book, and then I'll talk a little bit about the High Republic before going into this book itself. So for starters, the High Republic era is a completely new era to Star Wars. In Star Wars Legends, people may remember that they had a timeline going back by like thousands and thousands of years. I think at one point it goes back by like tens of thousands of years. There's like, I think some stories which try and explain the start of the universe, all that kind of stuff. It does get very messy in Legends. It's another reason why I generally prefer canon, which is quite a controversial opinion, but I haven't consumed a huge amount of Legends content. There are some brilliant things in there, and one of my all-time favourite stories, the Force Unleashed book, the Force Unleashed game, rather, that is one of my all-time favourite stories. I've got a tattoo of the character from it, Galen Marek, also known as Starkiller. He's played by Sam Witwer, who actually voices not only the character and does motion capture and stuff, but he also voices the character of Darth Maul in Solo and also in Clone Wars and Rebels. He does a few other voices here and there. He's quite into Star Wars as well. You see him do interviews and stuff, but this isn't the Sam Witwer Appreciation Hour, because I would love that. Essentially, the High Republic era is not even in Legends. You go back to, it's 200 years before the Phantom Menace. So the Phantom Menace, in the terms I often use to kind of so you understand the timeline in this, is the out-of-universe most commonly used one is before or after the Battle of Yavin. The Battle of Yavin is it's a New Hope. It's what happened in A New Hope. When they blow up the Death Star, that is the Battle of Yavin. So generally, outside of universe, we kind of tell things by their years before or years after that. So for a little bit of clarity, the Phantom Menace was 32 years before the Battle of Yavin. I think Attack of the Clones was 22 years before that. The Clone Wars lasted for 3 years, and Revenge of the Sith was 19 years before the Battle of Yavin. So by the point of A New Hope, both Leia and Luke are 19 years old. Empire Strikes Back is 3 years after A New Hope, so that's 3 years after the Battle of Yavin, and Return of the Jedi is around a year after that, so it's 4 years after the Battle of Yavin. So you see it's BBY and ABY. I'm not going to delve into all the sequels and all that sort of jazz, but that's just a general idea for you guys. So this book is set around 232 years before the Battle of Yavin, and for context, when Yoda dies in Return of the Jedi, he's 900 years old. In this book, he is around 650 to 700 years old. So it's quite a big gap there. And he's not the only character who's actually alive in this, but I won't delve into that at the moment. But it's good comparison, because if you think about 200 years prior, that was 1821, which is a very long time in human history ago, especially for any Americans listening, because obviously I think the Declaration of Independence was like 1776 or something along those lines. I apologise if I'm wrong. I'm more of an expert in Star Wars stuff, not American history. But if you think like modern America wasn't even really a thing 200 years ago, there was obviously people going over there and you were an independent nation, but it was nothing like it is now. And even in England, you know, technology in itself has gone exponentially huge compared to like the society changes and all kinds of other things. 200 years is a long time. So in Star Wars, it's considered to be the golden age of the Jedi, the golden age of the Republic, because in the prequel era, one of the big things that people complain about in the prequels and things is, the Jedi aren't, you know, as amazing as we thought they were going to be. You know, they're kind of douchey, you know, they're very dogmatic and very rigid. It's like, yes, that is the problem. That's why they allowed basically Palpatine to raise to power. Essentially, one bloke and his apprentice managed to overthrow the entire Republic, cause a massive war with two huge factions fighting against each other, purged almost all of the Jedi, turned the whole galaxy against them, and did all of that while there were like 10,000 Jedi in the galaxy, which is just madness. Like, you shouldn't be able to do that. But it just goes to show the hubris, which is a common word they use to describe the Jedi of that era, where they were so sure that the Sith wouldn't return, or they weren't really fazed by it. They just didn't do enough to really seek him out. And obviously anyone watching the prequels or Clone Wars, you go, it's obvious Palpatine is a Sith Lord. Obviously there's a lot of dramatic irony that the audience get that, you know, people inside don't. But all of that said, the High Republic, as the term goes, the High Republic, the height of the Republic, the best time. The Chancellor in this is really cool as well. They're not a Sith Lord, as far as we can tell. I don't think they are going to be, but it's meant to be the Jedi when they're at their best. It's meant to be the Republic when it's at its best, is that sort of thing. So it's a really interesting era to explore, especially because it doesn't have all the entanglement of legends all interwoven in it. When they eventually go into the Great Sith Wars, when it had the Jedi against the Sith, which I think ended approximately 1,000 years before the events of the prequel trilogy. So you've got to think that that's going to be around 1,032 years before the Battle of Yavin. And Yoda was born 896 years before the Battle of Yavin. So you've got to think that it was about 100 and let's just say 150 years for ease. It was around 150 years before Yoda was born that the Great Sith and Jedi Wars sort of ended. So Sith aren't going to appear in the High Republic. There's the series The Acolyte, which is going to be coming out, which is right at the tail end of the High Republic era. I think that's going to be around 50 years before the Phantom Menace. That is going to be going into the Sith. It's like a mystery thriller, apparently. It's apparently going to be like the Sith hiding in the shadows, slowly rising to power. There's a lot of rumours that Darth Plagueis is going to be in it, which is Palpatine's master, potentially his master, which in Legends is Darth Tenebrous. And so The Acolyte, which I'm very excited for, which isn't coming out till 2022, I think, on Disney+, that's going to go into sort of the transitionary phase between the High Republic era and the prequel era Jedi. So that's all sort of me waffling on, giving background information. As I said, you can tell that this isn't as scripted as it normally is. Normally I do have bullet points and ways to rein myself back in. I don't in this, and I've had some people say they really enjoyed my last book review, and some people really enjoy when I go a little bit off the rails and kind of go off on one waffling. I haven't had anyone tell me they don't like it. I just have the paranoia that maybe people don't like it as much, but I'm going to try not to waffle too much. It's just something I get excited about and I just love talking about it. And I talk to Megan far too much about this sort of stuff. So when I get left in a room by myself to talk about it, I just become untethered. So yeah, with that in mind, that's the era of the Jedi. Now, there's a lot of content that's coming out for the High Republic. It's going to be the big stuff for Star Wars for the next at least 5 years. Apparently, there are going to be 3 phases of the High Republic. We're in the first phase at the moment. And these phases are Phase 1, Light of the Jedi, Phase 2, Quest of the Jedi, Phase 3, Trials of the Jedi. So apparently it says, I'm looking online at an article now on Star Wars, it says that apparently Phase 1 is going to run through 21 and 2022, then Phase 2 is apparently going to be coming out slightly after that, so we can assume that probably tail end of 2022, maybe 2023 is when Phase 2 is going to start. If that runs for another 2-3 years, as I said, it's probably going to be between 5 and 10 years the High Republic era is going to go across, and I'm very excited. From what I've read about it, it's going to be incredible. So at the moment, we're just in the Light of the Jedi phase, which is the name of this book. Huzzah! It's like they thought about this through a lot, unlike some other content that's been coming out recently. Not The Mandalorian, I'm pointing at you, sequel trilogy. As much as I do love the sequel trilogy, there's very clearly there wasn't quite a plan. So what they've done with this, it used to be called Project Luminous, that was its sort of code name and things, and it was basically 5 Star Wars creators, as well as a gentleman, I think his name is Michael Sinclair. So Michael Sinclair, along with Charles Soule, Claudia Gray, Cavan Scott, Daniel Jose Wilder and Justina Ireland. These 5 creators, they got together with no involvement from Lucasfilm or anything like that, and they basically brainstormed this huge amount of ideas. They went on this big retreat for, I think, several days or weeks, and they were brainstorming all the different ideas they could have and what they wanted to do with this era. So when a lot of people come out without reading any of the books or content and waggle their finger and go, well, the High Republic's not good, it sucks because they've done this. It doesn't have Kathleen Kennedy involved, so you can't use that card. Lucasfilm Story Group barely touched this until after these 5 creators had kind of come up with what they wanted to do and figure out where they wanted to go with this. So before people get on the bandwagon and start complaining about how bad these are, don't listen to those people, because whenever they complain on Facebook groups and that sort of stuff, under further investigation, what normally happens is they haven't read any of the content. They just hear other people whinging about the content who are butthurt and are whinging about how, the new canon and Disney and blah, blah, blah. If you don't like it, right, just go away and stop whinging about it, because this is a really cool era, and I'm just so thrilled that content creators that I love are managing to do their own thing without being constrained by the Skywalker saga. As much as I love Charles Soule and Claudia Gray and all of them, problem is that when you write stories within the Skywalker saga, like Charles Soule, he wrote a mini-series about Lando that I've tackled. He's written the Obi-Wan and Anakin comic that I've tackled. There's the Darth Vader comics, which is some of the best Star Wars comics there are, which I'm soon to tackle in the future. And obviously Claudia Gray, I had her on the podcast. I think it's released in December time. I chatted with her about her books. She hasn't delved into the realm of Star Wars comics as of yet. She hasn't closed that door, but she's written 5 Star Wars books. Lost Stars, Master and Apprentice, Leia, Princess of Alderaan, Bloodline, and also the newest book, Into the Dark, which is a High Republic book. So you've got these content creators where, when they've had to write about certain characters, like Claudia Gray writing about Leia, like Charles Soule having to write about Darth Vader, they add a lot of depth to the characters, and they're really, really good content. But the problem is there's only so much you can actually do. You couldn't write a Princess Leia book and have her die, because we all know when she dies, so it just wouldn't make any sense. So this whole thing, what the most exciting part about the High Republic is, aside from like Yoda, and then Yarrow Poof, who I'll get into at some point later, aside from those two characters, anyone else is free game. People could pop up and die straight away. There's one or two other characters that I'll get into, probably in the tier 2, tier 3, or whatever I end up calling it. The sort of next phases when I get into a little bit more spoiler territory. There are other characters which I know aren't going to die until a certain thing happens because of other content we know about. But that was specifically put in there by threads by these creators in their own content. So there's a lot of stuff that I'm just excited about with this. And so to summarise the content that is out before I start getting into a vague semblance of a review, because I've been talking for 15 minutes now and haven't even really given my thoughts, apart from saying I like it. So the content that's out at the moment, so as of recording this, I'm recording this in March 2021. So the first books that came out was The Light of the Jedi by Charles Soule and The Test of Courage by Justina Ireland. Test of Courage is for more young readers. That's as described as middle school, so pre-teens essentially, is generally for all ages and things. I haven't read that. Apparently it is actually surprisingly good and has a really interesting character in it who's like a Jedi prodigy. I am going to be reading that probably at some point, as long as I can get other stuff finished in time before the next ones. But essentially there was Light of the Jedi, Charles Soule's book, which is what I'm reviewing today, and that's an adult book. So it's quite thick, it's quite wordy, there's a lot of information in there, and there's some more deep themes and things in there. Test of Courage is generally a slightly younger audience. Now Claudia Gray's book, Into the Dark, that was released in February, which I now have. I have a copy of, but I have not read any of it yet. I wanted to start reading it tonight, but last night, but I was like, no, because if I start doing that, I'll start getting a little bit confused and things. But that was released, and that's a YA book, so young adult. And as I talked about with Claudia Gray in my interview with her, young adult just means the main characters are generally teenagers, and generally the themes are a little bit less heavy, the language is a little bit less heavy, and the books are a little bit shorter. That's just vaguely the difference. But if you read any of Claudia Gray's book, I think Master and Apprentice isn't a young adult book. If you read that and then you read Leia, Princess of Alderaan, Lost Stars, and Bloodline, actually I think Bloodline might be an adult air quotes book as well. You read those 4 books, you can't tell. There's not like a clear line where it's like, oh yeah, this clearly young adult. Young adult books are brilliant, okay? I have had this misconception myself. Do not be put off by it being a young adult book. The only basis vaguely is that it's vaguely aimed at teenagers. So there's not going to be generally hardcore sex in there, huge amounts of swearing or really intense drug use, and the main characters are going to be teenagers. But obviously all the things I just named aren't really in Star Wars anyway. Well, aren't in Star Wars really strongly anyway. So you don't have to worry about any young adult novels, especially in Star Wars, being aimed at a younger audience, because I assure you, I have read a lot of them, you cannot tell that they're aimed more so at teenagers. It's just a way to classify the books. So with that cleared up, they're the books that are out at the moment. Cavan Scott has got a book which is going to be called, I think, The Rising Storm. That should be coming out in, I believe it's June, and that is going to be a sequel sort of book to Light of the Jedi, which is this one. In addition to those books as well, there is also going to be, or that are already out, the comics. Now, I think the 3rd issue of the High Republic comic is out at the moment. I have not yet received my copy because we're in the UK, we get them like a couple weeks later than they do in the US, and because I have a subscription service with Forbidden Planet, I basically just get 1 or 2 deliveries each month with just a batch of comics, rather than getting, 10 deliveries in a month costing me an extra few quid each time they get delivered. I would just rather wait a little bit. So I've read the 2nd comic of the High Republic comics, and there's also the High Republic Adventures. High Republic Adventures are from IDW. Now, anyone who listens to Star Wars comics in canon would know that I haven't tackled any IDW comics. There are loads of Star Wars Adventures comics, and they're just aimed at a younger audience. They are aimed at a much younger audience than young adult books are, for clarity. So they are aimed for basically children, not 6-year-olds necessarily. I mean, I'm sure there are 6-year-olds who probably could read it, but it's more so before teenagers, sort of pre-teens, between the ages of probably 8 to sort of 14, so that general age. So I hadn't really tackled any IDW comics. I have bought Cavan Scott's Vader's Castle. There's 2 of those comics, which are like horror. They're kind of like horror anthology stories aimed for all audiences. I'm quite excited by them, so I'm going to be reading them at some point in the future. But that's all the Star Wars content out, and I've got the Star Wars Adventures comic number 1. That is written by Daniel Jose Older, and the other comics, the sort of main teenage-based ones, those are just called The High Republic. Those are written by Cavan Scott. So, that's all the content we have out at the moment, as well as the Acolyte series that's going to be coming out in the future, as well as the Rising Storm book by Cavan Scott that's coming out, as well as there's going to be other High Republic content as well. But from my knowledge, as recording this, that is everything we know of at this moment. Aside from there's a VR game, virtual reality, where you wear a headset and you've got, I think it's on the Oculus 2. There's a High Republic game where you go with Yoda to some sort of ancient temple, and it's like got a story. I think there's like a few hours of content in there. I can't warrant spending £500 on virtual reality goggles to play a game, which is probably another £20-30 on top of that, just for one High Republic story. I've listened to a couple of people review it. They say it's lots of fun if you've already got it, but spending £500 is probably about $600 or $700. So I'm not spending that kind of money to get one story of Star Wars in virtual reality, which I'm not overly fussed on. So they're the current High Republic stuff that's out. I've kind of gone over the era without talking about too much and things. So finally, I am now going to get into the spoiler-free review of Light of the Jedi. So, I want to start off by saying, if anyone listens to this show very much, they'll know that I absolutely love Charles Soule. Now, Charles Soule in Star Wars had only done comics and things I mentioned prior, but he hadn't delved into the book realm. Now, he's written plenty of other books. He's got loads of stuff he's released himself that I haven't actually read, I'm ashamed to say, but if this book is anything to go by, they are going to be excellent. So, Light of the Jedi, let's pick this up. It's published by Del Rey, if anyone's interested by the publisher, and on the back, there's not even a proper blurb. It says, for over 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice. And that's that. So this book is basically, the premise is there's something called the Great Disaster, which I will go into probably on my second tier part of the review. Something called the Great Disaster, something very, very bad happens. The first third of the book is the Jedi trying to sort out this problem, and it is brilliant. I remember that I don't swear on this podcast. If anyone listens to Genuine Chit-Chat, I swear a lot. I try and keep the Star Wars podcasts clean, and I almost swore quite heavily there, but it is brilliant. It hits the ground running, essentially. There's quite a lot of stuff where I feel like the concept art actually really helps with the visualizations of certain things, because there's certain species that are mentioned in this, and I'm fairly savvy when it comes to Star Wars species, the ones that I know of. I'm fairly savvy. I know what a Twi'lek is, I know what a Chadrian is, I know what a Chadrafan is. I'm not just going to sit here and name every species, because that would be boring. But when you are told about them, there's still so many different variables. The cover has got, it's got a Wookiee. Everyone should know what a Wookiee is. Chewbacca is the species. And then it's got 2 humans, and then it also has a Twi'lek. Twi'lek. I say one or the other interchangeably. It's TWI''LEK. Twi'lek, because they have Leku. Leku is the tentacles. Famous Twi'leks, Bib Fortuna in Return of the Jedi, Jabba's right-hand man who gets mind-tricked by Luke, and also the Jedi of the Clone Wars era, Ayla Secura. Both of those are probably the most famous Twi'leks I can think of, but they're basically humans that their skin colour is normally, well, it's not like white or the sort of the standard colours that humans on Earth are. There's green, there's actual literally pink, there's blue, so there's different colours of Twi'leks and things. But me sort of divulging into Twi'leks and getting stuck on that weird little caveat, essentially the concept art they released for this, I will be, when I post this on social media, I'm going to include some of those things, and for Patreons I'm going to do it as well, and I will also include a link so people can check them out themselves. There's also a cover variant of the High Republic, which is the it's either the Blanche Kenny or the Kenny Blanche variant that I've got, because I've got my hands on like 8 variants of the High Republic #1, and that shows the Nile, and one of the Nile is a Twi'lek, so I'll get into the Nile in a moment. So basically there's a big disaster that happens. There's loads of Jedi that have to kind of scramble and try and sort out this problem. And that's the first part of the book. The other parts of the book are sort of the aftermath of this and finding out, who caused the great disaster, how they can resolve it going forward, all these sorts of other things. And then obviously the book ends with a few threads going off elsewhere, which will assumedly be confirmed in the Rising Storm book. So, also for clarity, the comics are set, I think Light of the Jedi is the first book in the timeline. I believe that the other two books do reference the Great Disaster, but I believe that Light of the Jedi is the main big look into the Great Disaster. And the comics are set after this book. In fact, the comics, pretty towards the start, there is a character in it that something happens to them in the book which directly you can see has happened to them in the comics. I'm trying not to spoil too many things, but I will get into that slightly later in the review. So you've got the Jedi of the Golden Era, the High Republic era. So they've all got really cool looking lightsabers because, frankly, they change a lot of their lightsabers due to aesthetic. They've got lots of different robes they like to wear, and they're not as dogmatic. They're not. In that realm, it basically means, the Jedi of the prequel era, they are very much like, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. And they're quite naysayers. They say no a lot. And they're very rigid in their ideology. And I think the idea of the High Republic is to show what happened to them when they weren't so rigid with their ideology, and then how over the space of 200 years and certain things happening made the Jedi change into what you see in the prequel era, which then allowed them to be basically so arrogant and so up themselves that Sidious was allowed to reign to power. That's what Luke says in The Last Jedi as well, which is another controversial film that I really like. So, not to get into that. So, the other thing to note in this as well is there's something called Starlight Beacon. And this is something that the Chancellor of the time in the High Republic is put into place, which is meant to be helping with the Outer Rim getting contact from the Republic. So the Republic is, and the way the galaxy kind of generally works, is there's the core worlds, then the inner, mid, and outer rims. The outer rims is where a lot of the Mandalorian is, and it's kind of like the wild, wild west, the outlaws are out there. It's when you can do where there's not as much. It's kind of like in Earth, if you are in the Western world a lot of the time, or places that are considered first world, where England, America, Australia, I'm just saying those three because they're English-speaking countries that I vaguely know some semblance of about, and I don't want to ill-inform anyone, and, most of Europe and things. They're the sort of place, you can rely on the police generally. They've got hospitals. There's generally infrastructure that is meant to benefit the people and is what is considered the modern, in air quotes, world. When you get to sort of other places which haven't been built up, they're not as commercialized, they don't have as good technology or access to medical care and things like that, there's not so much of a government intertwined infrastructure, that is when you delve into, second and third world countries. Well, the mid and outer rim, there's not necessarily planets there that are, derelict completely, but there's less of a hand of the centralized government. The Republic doesn't have the resources or the interest to go out there and to specifically spend all the amount of time like they would on Coruscant or Alderaan or Naboo, places like that. So the idea is in this era is that the Republic are trying to they're trying to reach out to outer rim worlds to try and help them. That if there's crime, like crime lords run a lot of outer rim worlds and things because the Republic just can't afford the resources to go out there and sort out every crime lord. So the whole Starlight Beacon is this massive beacon that not only helps the technology, so when you see people have holocomms, so communicators, when you're seeing people in Star Wars as holograms talking to each other, if they're really far away from each other, there has to be something to kind of boost the signal in some way. And in this, Starlight Beacon is meant to be one of those big things. So it's meant to be if there's a Jedi or there's a person trying to contact another person from the core worlds of like Coruscant or whatever, trying to contact someone in the outer world, the Starlight Beacon is kind of like a bouncing off point. So it kind of, the signal really bounds off the Starlight Beacon relay, and therefore it means that people can be contacted from the outer rim a lot easier and that sort of stuff. Obviously, remembering this is 200 years before the prequels. So that Starlight Beacon, that's a big part of this story and about the High Republic era, is trying to put these beacons in to help contact with the outer rim worlds. So you've got the Jedi, you've got that, and then you've got a villain, a group of antagonists called the Nile. Now, once again, I'm not going to delve too much into the Nile here. I'll do that in the next tiers. But this is a lot of information that's been told before these books were even released and things, so I'm not spoiling anything. The Nile they are described as punk rock space Viking anarchists. They are essentially, they don't believe, like with the things with the Sith and the Jedi, is the Sith have their own code. The Jedi have their own code. The Nile aren't meant to. The Nile are meant to be these marauders that have just kind of collected together and are causing havoc. But they're still just kind of seen almost like pirates. They're just kind of seen like, oh, they're just like space pirates. Like they're, there's not a lot of them. They're not really banding together and doing a lot. They're just out there causing havoc, and we need to stop them when we can. That is how the Nile are perceived generally. And this book does give a good insight into the Nile and things, but that's basically the main antagonists of the High Republic era, or at least for a while. There are other antagonists, which are the Drengir, but I believe that the Drengir are going to be featuring are more in the Into the Dark book by Claudia Gray, and I think they're also going to feature more heavily as the High Republic phases kind of continue. But at the moment, I'm focusing on this book is the Nile. And so the last few bits and pieces here before I start getting into vaguely spoiler territory, but once again, I'll give you guys plenty of warning. There is also the technology is different of the High Republic, which is quite cool. So they've got these ships called the Vectors, which I recommend people check out the concept art for these. They can be flown, seemingly they can be flown by anyone, in theory, but their weapon systems are powered up by a Jedi's lightsaber, which is a very, very cool part. So if there's an emergency, and you, as an example, as a listener, who I presume you're not a Jedi, if you are just, stranded somewhere and there's a vector there, you can jump in that in theory and fly it, but you wouldn't be able to do the weapon systems or anything like that. If you're a Jedi, you put your lightsaber in there, and then the console glows with the same color that your kyber crystal is, which is a really, really cool idea. And then you can use the weapons and things. Now, essentially, they have almost no shielding at all. They're very, very lightweight, very thin, stripped back. There's not a lot to them, but the idea is meant to be that when Jedi are flying the Vectors, they fly as like a group, almost like a swarm in a way, as a flock of birds, however you want to put it. And they're meant to sort of, using the Force, connect with each other and all fly together. And the idea is that if they're all sort of like synchronized together, flying ships that maybe don't have that much shielding, using their Jedi reflexes and working as a team, they shouldn't take any hits, and therefore they should be able to fly about and kind of, take on whatever enemies they have. But obviously this is a period of time where there's not really war, essentially, that it doesn't really happen. So the Jedi are normally called upon to sort out, a lot of the time it is crime bosses or marauders, space pirates, whatever. Just sort of low-key, almost gangs. So it's almost like the army being sent to sort out gangs. And I know that's maybe a controversial topic in certain areas of this world, but if you just think of it being that's how they resolve things, is sending the Jedi out. They're meant to be peacekeepers. They're not meant to be, like in the prequels, the generals of war and, going to planets to invade and basically take their resources and stuff. They're meant to just, a couple of Vectors go out, should be able to outmaneuver any pilots. They've got enough weapons and systems and things on there to really help. And if you're clever enough and you're in tune with the Force and etc., you can fly a Vector so well, in theory, you won't get hit, and therefore the lack of shielding isn't a problem. So, that is one aspect of it. There are other vehicles. There's the Vanguard as well, which is essentially like the Vector, but on the ground. So it's basically just a car. It's not going to look like a car, but imagine just like a car, but you can only activate the weapons with a Jedi's lightsaber, things like that, quite lightweight. But they also have this cannon thing, which can be activated, shoots this massive blast and whatnot. There's quite cool things. There's a few other bits and pieces of vehicles as well. There's like a speeder, which has almost no shielding of any kind, and that's also one of these sort of aspects. So a lot of these ships are basically Jedi's own cruisers and ships that don't have shielding and things, because the Jedi at the time are so in tune with the Force that they don't necessarily need it. Whereas when you go into the more prequel era and some of the ships they fly, like the Jedi Starfighters, you see primarily in Revenge of the Sith at the start, and you'll see Obi-Wan fly one in Attack of the Clones when he goes to Geonosis. That's a sort of triangular pointed one, and then the ones in Revenge of the Sith have been upgraded a little bit, and they are kind of triangular, but they have sort of the dent in the middle. With those sort of ships, they have a bit more shielding, they have a bit more weight to them and things, and I think the idea is meant to show that the Vectors don't need it because the Jedi at the time are so in tune with the Force, they don't need them. So that is a general overview of what the High Republic era kind of is. And for clarity, I think Light of the Jedi, I think it is one of the best Star Wars books I've read. Now, I haven't read every Star Wars book because there are a lot. Talking about canon here. I've read all of Claudia Gray's books aside from Into the Dark, so those 4. I've read the 3 Aftermath books, which is by Chuck Wendig, the Aftermath trilogy. I've read the Ahsoka book by E.K. Johnston. I think I've read a couple more. I'm just trying to think. I've got the Certain Point of View book. That might be it. I think I'm missing 1 or 2 books in my mind, but generally I've read a fair amount, but I haven't read all of them. Of all of those books, as brilliant as pretty much all of them are, I think Light of the Jedi is the best. Now, the reason that I think this is not just because I'm in love with Charles Soule, but it is also because the first part of the book, the book is split into 3 parts. The first part of the book is them dealing with this great disaster. And I just think the way it is written and the amount of depth that goes into certain characters and just the imagery involved and everything, you really get absorbed into it. There were several nights where I would be like, I'll just read, this book for 15, 20 minutes, read 1 chapter, and I'd be reading it for like 2 hours, like easy. There was one night I think I stayed up to about 2:30 in the morning on like a Tuesday, just reading a book. So it's really, really good, and I can't recommend it enough. Whether or not you've read basically any Star Wars books or any comics or anything like that, it doesn't really matter. All you need to know is that Jedi have laser swords and can use the Force, and space travel is a thing in the universe. As long as you understand those 2 concepts, which really you don't even need to consume any other Star Wars content to understand that, you'll get this book, because it starts in a realm of not expecting you to have read all this crazy content and watched all of this. You don't need that. It's such a good introduction to not only the High Republic era in itself, but also people into the realm of novels. It's a really, really good way, and I'm very excited to read Claudia Gray's book as well, because I do love Claudia Gray as an author. So on that basis, I say this is an excellent book. I recommend to anyone. I think there are audiobook versions out, or they're soon to be. But if you are going to pick up any Star Wars book at all, I would say this is a great one to hit the ground running. This has got emotional weight to it. The characters in it are amazing. As I said, I've only read the book once, and there are so many characters that really stand out as incredible. And one little bit I'll say, which once again isn't a spoiler, but one thing I'll say about this is there's a part in the book which is all of these Jedi are basically using the Force, and it explains in like 1 sentence each how they view the Force or how they perceive it. And they all perceive it in a different way, which I really, really like. One of them views it like water, like an ocean and things. One of them views it like music, like they hear the call of the Force, the music, and when they try and tune into certain people, depending on how their music sounds, their melody, that Jedi in particular can kind of tell certain things about them. If the melody's off or something, there's something under the sort of surface that's not shown. There's lots of different ways. I think that there's a Wookiee Padawan in this, and I'm pretty certain that they see it, as I think a lot of Wookiees do, as sort of a tree and things, or like as nature. So, and there's just 1 chapter where they go into that sort of detail, and it's just so well written, and I like that it's not trying to tell people there's a specific way to view the Force or to perceive it, because people can view it or perceive it in any way they want, or however they just do. And I think that mirrors a lot of how people view the universe, excluding all of the sort of the extremist religion views and the things that oppress people in a lot of the doctrine, which I'm not going to get into at all on this podcast ever. Some people believe in different religions. Some people believe in certain vague semblance of spirituality. Some people are atheists and they don't believe in anything. And I think what this book does very well, just in that one part, it's only a very small part of the book, but in that part of the book, it really shows how, although people have different perceptions of the Force, it's a really good way that they all work together and that they all kind of, they feel the same thing, they just interpret it in different ways. And I really, really like that. I think that's a very, very cool way of handling it. So that is just the spoiler-free, completely review of this. Now, the next phase, I am going to go into a little bit of details and stuff. Once again, I'm in no way trying to spoil the book for anyone. I'm just going to highlight a few characters I quite liked, a few little bits and pieces here that I quite liked, but just enough so that you'll be able to have a conversation with someone maybe about the book without having read it, but I'm not going to be spoiling anything about it. But I am going to tell you guys what the Great Disaster is. So I'll give you a moment. If that is all the information you want to know about this book and you want to try and go in blind, to clarify, when I read the book, the amount of information you've just heard from me waffling on for the last 40 minutes, that is basically the amount of information I knew going into this book. So there's your warning for that. The next part is going to be a little bit more detail on this sort of stuff, and yeah, we'll go from there. So now this second tier of the review. So this is obviously going to be a bit more information than I said prior. So we're going to start off with some of the characters I quite liked. So I'm just going to name a few of them. There's Loden Greatstorm, which is one of the coolest names ever. He is a Twi'lek, and he is a Padawan called Bel Zetifar. Now, Loden Greatstorm, as I clarified, being a Twi'lek, and I explained what a Twi'lek was slightly earlier, he is maybe my favourite character in this whole thing. He's charming, he's strong in the Force, he's powerful, he's got a good relationship with his Padawan, so really, really like that character. And his Padawan, Bel, is amazing as well. So they're two of the best characters in my opinion. The next one is Avar Kriss. Now, she, as well as Loden Greatstorm, is on the cover of the book. And on social media, you should be able to see my photos of the book, or you can just Google Light of the Jedi. I'm sure you'll find plenty of photos. But Avar Kriss, she's a blonde-haired white woman, and she is seemingly one of the most powerful of the Jedi at this time. She has a very special power which can connect the minds of Jedi, which is very interesting. And when the Great Disaster happens, which I'll tackle a little bit later, she uses this power to... It really helps. If she hadn't been involved in this in some way, then the Great Disaster would be even worse than it already is. But that power is very interesting, and she actually hears the Force like a song, which is what I mentioned in sort of part 1 of this. And I just think she's such an interesting character, and I think she's going to be one of the main central characters of the High Republic era. And because she's human, there's no chance that she's going to, well, in theory, no chance she's going to live for like 200 years, and we're going to see her go then. So we may see her death in a horrible, violent way, or we may see her death just she gets old. Who knows at this point, but that probably won't be for a long time down the line. Next up we have Buryaga. Now Buryaga is actually a Wookiee, and he is a Wookiee Padawan, and he speaks the language of Shriwook, which is the main language of the Wookiees. Until the other day I thought it was the only language of the Wookiees, but apparently there are 3 languages of the Wookiees, but Shriwook is the most common one. And what's best about him is he views the Force, as I kind of said, like a tree and things, I think, and his lightsaber's really cool, but he's very in tune with things, but because he's still a Padawan, you do get quite a nice balanced perspective from him. And one thing I find really sweet is actually that Buryaga's master is actually a human. She's called Nib Assek. And one of the things about her that I like the most is that she specifically learnt the language of Shriwook so that she could take on Buryaga as a Padawan. Because basically, when you enter the Jedi Order as a child, you are a youngling. When you're a youngling, you're just learning the basics, all those sort of things. In Attack of the Clones, when Obi-Wan goes to see Yoda, and they talk about Kamino, and you've got that classic scene where Yoda kind of like makes jokes to Obi-Wan in front of the younglings, which is one of my favourite scenes in any Star Wars. It just shows that Yoda's really good with kids, and I just love that. Those kids in there, they are younglings. Now, when you get to a certain age, normally I think sort of teenager sort of age, you then can become a Padawan. You have to be chosen to become their Padawan, and Nib Assek wanted Buryaga to be hers and specifically learn his language. So I just thought that was really sweet. So she's like the only one really in this book that can understand him, aside from people, generally understand where he's coming from due to being in tune with the Force and understanding his emotions and things. Understanding literally what he's saying word for word, Nib Assek is the only person in this so far who can speak Shriwook. So that's a really nice thing as well. You've then got a Jedi called Scare, and Scare is a Trandoshan. Trandoshans are lizard people, basically. Bosk is a Trandoshan, he's probably the most famous one, and generally speaking, Trandoshans are bad. Obviously, the term bad is kind of subjective, and I'm not going to delve into all that sort of stuff, but generally in Star Wars, Trandoshans are viewed as villains. So having Scare as or Skier, Skeer, having him as a Jedi makes it interesting, and it kind of adds a layer of things to them. It's just nice having such a wide variety of Jedi. And Skier has a Padawan as well called Keeve Trennis. Now, Skier and Keeve Trennis are both in the High Republic comics quite a lot. I believe that the comics themselves are focusing much more around Trennis at the moment. I've only read the first 2, as I say, but she seems to be the main character. She's really cool as well. Not much else to say on those 2 guys, but the book is really good. And yeah, if you want to read the comics, something happens to them and it gets referenced in the comics, but you find out what it is in the book, which I'm not going to spoil. Now, there's 3 more Jedi I just want to briefly mention. Once again, I'm not going to go through every single Jedi character, but just a couple worth naming. There's Mikkel Sutmani. He is an Ithorian, and I haven't seen an Ithorian Jedi much in this. There's one in I think it's the Mace Windu comic. No, it's the Jedi Fallen Order Dark Temple comic about Seer Junda and Eno Cordova when they were younger, essentially. And one of the Jedi there is an Ithorian as well. Ithorians, they're nicknamed Hammerheads. You'd see them, they're everywhere in Star Wars, really. I think the first appearance was in A New Hope. They're basically flat-headed. They kind of look like hammerhead sharks, like their heads kind of look like hammerhead sharks, and their mouths are on either side of their neck. So they, apart from one strange example that I can't remember exactly where it is, but there's somewhere in the canon there is one Ithorian who can speak Galactic Basic, even though this is thought to be by an Ithorian actually not possible. So either that's a continuity error or it's a very, very special Ithorian. But they speak as well in a language people don't understand, but the ships that they fly, the Vectors, have onboard translators. So whenever he talks in amongst the rest of the Jedi, it translates what he's saying, which I think is quite cool. There's another Jedi called Jorah Mali. She is very interesting, and she's a friend of Skier's. He has saved her on multiple occasions, and they have a really interesting relationship that I quite enjoy. And one of the things I like most about her is she actually has a white lightsaber crystal. And in the book, it says that she basically cleansed a Sith artifact, saber staff, and used that crystal. And the reason I flagged that up specifically is because Ahsoka Tano, one of the greatest Jedi ever, or who doesn't really identify as a Jedi, but still, she obviously from Clone Wars, Rebels, and now Mandalorian, she has white lightsabers, and in the book Ahsoka by E.K. Johnston, it goes into the detail of lightsaber cleansing. I think I've delved into that in the Mandalorian special episodes I've done of this, but in brief, basically, a Sith to turn a lightsaber red has to bleed it. You can see that in the Rise of Kylo Ren miniseries by Charles Soule, and you can also see it in the Darth Vader second run. It's called Darth Vader, Dark Lord of the Sith. It is the second run of Darth Vader comics, and it is in 2017, also written by Charles Soule, and in that as well, you get to see Vader bleed his lightsaber crystal, which in my opinion is one of the best moments in all of Star Wars. I'm not just talking about comics here, like it's probably my favourite moment in all Star Wars comics, but it's just incredible. I absolutely love it. And so after a Sith bleeds the lightsaber crystal and turns it red, what a Jedi can do, which I think before the Ahsoka book wasn't necessarily heard of, a Jedi can cleanse it. So they get rid of all the anger and the hate and things and basically do the exact opposite of what Sith did. And this is what Jorah Mali did to her lightsaber crystal. So when she puts it in her Vector ship, it makes everything light up white instead of the standard, which is normally green or blue. There's a few yellow ones as well. But I just thought that was really cool, and I just like the fact that lightsaber cleansing Ahsoka Tano wasn't the first person to do it, which is really cool. So the last Jedi I want to speak about is Porter Engel. He is an old Ikruki, Ikkrukki. I may be pronouncing that terribly wrong, but he is 300 years old. What he loves doing at the moment is, because he's like at the end, not quite the end of his life, but he's getting on a bit. He just likes to just chill out with the Jedi now. He doesn't like going on big missions and fighting a lot, but he's renowned for being a really big cook. And he's actually famous for his recipes, such as his 9-egg stew, which is really cool. And he used to be considered a legend within the Jedi Order. He was called the Blade of Bardota. And I won't spoil when in any part of this review, but there's a part in this book where he has to basically ignite his lightsaber and become the Blade of Bardota once again for a reason or another. And it is just brilliant. The way he sort of changes, the way that other characters around him kind of sense the change, it's just done really well. And I love it when you get those sorts of old masters. It's kind of like one of the reasons I really like the end scene of Attack of the Clones of Yoda. I know a lot of people don't like it, and that's completely fine. People can be their own opinions on that sort of stuff. But I love seeing someone who's like, an old master who is like a legend. And it's like, he doesn't really, he's just slow and stuff now. And then you see them when they need to pull their lightsabers out and go mental. I just love it. It's just one of my favourite things. And Porter Engel does exactly that. So, what's cooler than a badass old man, who can just beat anyone? It's just so cool. So really, really like Porter Engel. And as I said, he is an Ikrukian. So hard to pronounce, and from my knowledge they seem to generally only be in the High Republic. I'm just looking online right now, and no, I was wrong. They are actually, the first appearance is in the Poe Dameron comics, and surprise surprise, the writer of the Poe Dameron comics is Charles Soule. So Charles Soule seemingly created the Ikruki or Ikrukians, and They're quite peculiar looking. They're grey skinned. They've got sort of bulbous things on the top of their heads, but they're humanoid in shape and things. They also appear in the Resistance Reborn book, which I can say I haven't actually read. And then, yeah, as I said, appears in the High Republic Light of the Jedi. But this was when they were first identified as an Ikraki. So lots of convoluted stuff. But basically, Porter Engel is amazing, and I can't wait to see what else he does. A few other notable characters here. Once again, there are some characters I am specifically leaving out, either because there isn't enough information in the book for me to talk about them to not then spoil the book, or because I just don't want to mention them at all, because I do want some things to be surprises. So one of the other characters is the Chancellor, called Lena Soule, and after listening to an interview with, I think it was Charles Soule, basically the idea was, when the authors got together to do Project Luminous, they wanted to have a Chancellor who was actually good at being a Chancellor. Obviously, Chancellor Valorum, as seen in Phantom Menace, he was useless and corrupt, and that's how Palpatine basically became the Chancellor, because Padme did a vote of no confidence, and then obviously Palpatine was a Sith Lord and basically completely corrupted the Senate, set two opposing factions against each other, formulated the entirety of the Clone Wars, all in an effort to exterminate the Jedi. So, although the man's a genius, he's not the best Chancellor. Lena Soule is a very good Chancellor. She wants what is best for the galaxy, and she can be quite fearsome. There's quite a few notes where Jedi, when she's when she's having a go at someone, and the Jedi are just nearby, when she's not having a go at the Jedi for anything, but she's having a go at someone for something. One of the Jedi notes, like, "Oof, I wouldn't want to be on the other side of that." Like, nothing makes me scared except Lena Soule being angry. So, very interesting character, very fiery. She also has these two pet cat things that are kind of like tigers, I think, that are with her all times as sort of personal protection, which I think adds another layer of that, which is quite cool. There are other animals in this as well that become like companions and things, but I don't want to delve into that stuff at the moment anyway. But yeah, so Lena Soule, she's a Chancellor, and she's basically, from what we can tell, a good Chancellor who's good at her job and wants the best for the Republic and the galaxy at large. She's the one who comes up with the idea of Starlight Beacon. She's the one who's pushing for more connectivity. She often says, "We are all one Republic." That's her sort of motto thing. So she's a cool character. It's nice to see that. And then the last two I want to mention are actually a couple. One of them is called Joss. The other one is Pika, and both their surnames are Adren. So it's Joss Adren and Pika Adren. And it's just interesting having characters that aren't Jedi. They're actually mechanics or like contractors, and they get involved with the Great Disaster and are massively helpful. Without them, then the Great Disaster once again would have probably been a lot worse. But it's really interesting having two characters who aren't Jedi and having their opinions of the Jedi said in each of the chapters and things. So it's like, when the Great Disaster's happening, which I'm going to get into in a minute, when the Great Disaster's all happening, you've got like certain parts are from the perspective of certain characters. And when that happens, you get like sort of their inner thoughts in some ways. And I'm pretty sure either Pika or Joss are the ones who think of the Jedi as space wizards, and when the Jedi are doing certain things, they're a bit like, oh, what on earth are they doing? Like, I've heard that they could do this crazy stuff, but what are they doing in that? And I quite like that dynamic. I always like the human, sort of the normal person, the sort of I can't remember what the term is, and I'm blanking here, but when you get someone who's like powerful or crazy or magic, and you get that person who's with them who's just not, and it kind of grounds all of the characters because you get to see from like a normal person's perspective. I really, really like that, because the Jedi are incredible and they can do all these crazy things, but obviously with only 10,000 Jedi being in the galaxy, at least that was of the prequel era, I don't know if there's many more at the High Republic era. I don't think they've confirmed the specific amount. But if we go off the fact there are 10,000 Jedi, on Coruscant alone, in the prequel era, there are 1 trillion people. Now, for clarity, 1 billion people times by 1,000 is 1 trillion. On planet Earth right now, I believe there's around 7 billion people. So if you think that Coruscant by itself has approximately, over 100 times more people than Earth does, and you just think that is one planet, granted I think it's the most densely populated planet in the galaxy, but on that planet alone, and the majority of Jedi sort of generally reside there in the Jedi Temple, and there's only 10,000 Jedi. I mean, that's mental. If you think about on our planet of 7 billion people, if there are only 10,000 people who have this special religion or something, that's a very small percentage. Compared to the whole galaxy, it is completely minuscule. And so obviously a lot of people don't actually interact with the Jedi, and a lot of people don't get to see what the Jedi do. So Joss and Picca both have a really good view on that, and I just really like that. I like different perspectives, and I like things being different and new, and that's what this book does really, really well. So last of all, in this segment, I'm just going to talk about vaguely what the Great Disaster actually is. I'm not going to talk about the cause of it or anything else like that. I'm just going to tell you guys briefly what it actually is. It gets revealed in the first chapter or two of this book, and many people may already know what it is even without reading this book. But essentially what it is to do with hyperspace. Hyperspace in Star Wars is, it is a sci-fi, so it is, space fantasy. It's not true science, just to clarify. I'm not trying to justify anything like that. It is basically magic. But in the realm of Star Wars, what hyperspace lanes are and things is basically a hyperspace lane is a routed lane which ships can go faster than the speed of light in these lanes, and there is a guarantee that they will not collide with anything. That's generally how hyperspace works. When computers and things need to try and work out, the Millennium Falcon does it constantly, when the computer is trying to work out the best route and it's, shooting off, evading the Empire or whatever, when those things are happening, they track the routes using hyperspace lanes. So they zoom faster than the speed of light to whenever the nearest hyperspace lane is generally, or if there's already a hyperspace lane going through the area that they're in, and then they go on their path to wherever. Now, the thing is with hyperspace is that the lanes, to my knowledge and what seems to have been explained, have to be mapped out, they have to be thought of, they have to kind of be confirmed in a way. Once again, I'm not trying to get into all details in this because I think they explain it in the book and I'm not trying to explain all that. But essentially, when you're traveling hyperspace, it's meant to be confirmed that nothing will go in that lane, there won't be any obstructions or anything like that. However, what happens is that the first chapter is of a ship that is going through hyperspace as standard, not really worrying about anything, and there's some sort of object in the way of hyperspace. If they collide with that object at that speed, the ship would basically just completely disintegrate. It would hit it at such force, everyone on board would be killed immediately, and Lord knows what would happen. So the ship in the first chapter tries to avoid whatever it is in the way while they're traveling at hyperspace, and in doing so, the ship actually turns on its side, going through hyperspace, and rips itself apart. And then the Great Disaster is these pieces of this ship flying out, going faster than the speed of light, flying out in basically seemingly random directions, towards inhabited planets, towards other places and things. And the Great Disaster is the Jedi and some others trying to basically handle the situation of these pieces and chunks of ship randomly coming out from God knows where, hitting planets, and at the speed that they are going, if they hit a planet, they could literally destroy all life on the planet. That's how serious this is. So that's in general what the Great Disaster is. I don't want to delve into all the details of that because once again I do want you guys to read the book. But that is generally sort of my second phase of the review. I'm now going to move on to my third and final phase of the review. I'm going to give a little bit more details of certain things, a little bit more detail primarily on the antagonists of this, because the antagonists in the book, you don't really get much information about them until really about half, or at least a third through the book, but it's more so around halfway through the book and further, you get a lot more information on them. So I'm going to reserve that stuff about those, the antagonists, the Nile, and other details for this third part. So this is your final warning. I will not be ruining the whole book. I'm not going to ruin plot things or anything like that. I'm just going to go into one step of more detail before I close this off. So one of the things I wanted to leave to the end of this was actually talking about the Nile. So the Nile are the antagonists of seemingly the High Republic era, as well as these things called the Drengir. Now, the Drengir I haven't come to contact with as of yet. They're not in this book at all. They're not in I think they're in the third issue of the High Republic comics. They start making an appearance, and I don't know if they're in Into the Dark as of yet, because I haven't started reading that. So we can ignore the Drengir for the moment, so I'm going to talk about the Nile. Now, essentially, the Nile are the ones who are to blame for the Great Disaster. You find out that fairly reasonably on in the book, and it's not really a surprise considering they're the main antagonists and this horrendous disaster happens. I'm not going to explain why or how or anything like that. I'm just going to go into bits and pieces of detail about the Nile, which you find out in this book, but just to give a bit more information. So the Nile are, as I said right at the start of this, essentially, I think they were called punk space Vikings who believe in anarchy and whatnot. They have quite an interesting system of hierarchy, as in who's at the top and things. So at the very top, you've got the 3 leaders, which are the Tempest Runners, as well as the Eye. Now, the Eye is a guy called Markion Rowe, and the 3 leaders are Lorna D, who is a Twi'lek, Pan Ater, who is a Dowatin, and Kasav Milsko, who's a Weequay. Now, Twi'lek, I've explained them before on this, you should know. A Dowattin. Dowatins are big, hulking creatures. You would not want to get into a fight with one of these things. They are sentient, as are, I think, all of the Nile. And the ones you would know it from, if anyone has played Jedi Fallen Order, the game, I think it's the 6th sister. It might be the 7th, but it's either the 7th or 6th sister. She's a Dowattin, and she's one of the bosses that you fight. In addition, in the Darth Vader comics, that same sister is actually in there as an Inquisitor, because that's who you fight. And also in The Force Awakens in Maz Kanata's castle, there's 2 people sat on this big sofa thing. One of them is a woman who is wearing a lot of black makeup, and she calls the First Order, telling them that BB-8 is at Maz Kanata's castle. She is sat next to this gentleman, and this gentleman is also a Dowattin. So he's a Dowattin, the 6th or 7th sister is a Dowattin, and then you do see them a little bit elsewhere in the canon and things. They're big creatures, they've got like horns coming out of their chins, and then the Weequay. If anyone has seen Star Wars Rebels or Clone Wars, they all know of a Weequay, who is my favourite character in almost anything, and that is Hondo Ohnaka. Hondo is just one of the greatest characters in anything. I love him. Weequays, they're humanoid. They kind of look like humans, but their skin on their face is seemingly quite leathery. They're normally quite sort of darkish colours, like purple and things like that. And they do just look quite standard like humans, but their skin is of different texture and tone, and it gives their face, like it makes certain parts of it more pronounced, so they look more skull-like. So that's basically what a Weequay is. So you've got the sort of hierarchy of the Nile. As I said, the top 3 are the Tempest Runners, and then you've got, below them are Storms, below them are Clouds, and below them are Strikes. So you can see the hierarchy is to do with storms and things, which is quite interesting. Now, one other interesting thing is that the Nile can use something called the Paths, which is basically a way to traverse hyperspace in a way that is different to how everyone else can. So instead of using hyperspace lanes, they can basically go where they want. A good comparison would be, if you are walking through the woods or something and you're on one of those nature walks, there's normally specific pathways that you can walk down. There's normally some gravel or things and signposts and etc. Those sorts of ways of walking through the forest is kind of how you see it. So that would be a hyperspace lane. Now what the paths are basically, when you walk through the woods and the forest things, you can very easily go through the trees and go through these sorts of other places that are the less trodden path. They can still get you to where you need to go, and if you know where you're going and what you're doing, you can actually get there quicker. That's the best way to explain it. Now, one of the most interesting parts about this is someone who helps him with the paths is someone called Mari Santeca. Now, that surname may sound familiar to you because Lor Santeca is the old man at the start of The Force Awakens that Kylo Ren kills. He's actually someone who's in the Rise of Kylo Ren comics. He is part of a family who have always been either friends with or in some way worship the Jedi. They're not Force sensitive from what we can tell, but they are people who have regularly helped the Jedi, and his clan goes back generations. There are 2 other Santecas that actually appear in this book. I'm not going to go into detail about them because, fun to read it, but it was just quite cool seeing the Santecas appear again. And in one of the interviews I heard with Charles Soule, he just loves Lor Santeca. And, Lor Santeca, as I said, is one of the first people you see in the sequel trilogy at all. And he talks to Poe Dameron at the start on Jakku, and he's the one who actually gives piece of the map to Poe Dameron to help them find Luke Skywalker. And he's a friend of Luke's. In the Rise of Kylo Ren comics, there's flashbacks where Kylo was like, or when he was called Ben Solo, and when he was young and Luke was sort of training him and taking him around places, Lor Santeca would go around with them quite a lot. So it's quite interesting, that little connection to the Santecas as well, that I quite liked. It's interesting that the Nile can basically use hyperspace in different ways to the rest of the galaxy, which is very intriguing. And once again, it goes into more details in the book that I'll let you to that. There's something that happens on the planet Eridu, and it's I want to mention that because that's actually where Tarkin comes from, and they're described as sort of warriors in a way. So they're kind of similar to Mandalorians in the realm of they're viewed as warriors, they're quite ruthless and things, and you don't want to get on their bad side. So Eridu comes up as well, which is quite intriguing. As well as all of those things, really the other stuff to sort of talk about is just the general pacing and the layout of the book. Now, as I said, the book is split into 3 phases. The first part of the book is the Great Disaster. So it's Jedi scrambling, trying to work out what on earth is going on with, these chunks of this ship flying out hyperspace and hitting things and trying to prevent it in any ways that they can. It's probably the strongest start to any book of Star Wars that I've read, and it is just excellent. It introduces characters expertly, it shows how they kind of view the Force expertly, it talks about how their ships work and things. There's a couple of pages you have to kind of reread because there's almost so much information you want to kind of make sure you absorb it all. But it's such a strong start to a book. The second part of the book is then the aftermath of the whole Great Disaster. It's kind of them trying to work out how it was caused, what sort of happened, and how they can prevent it going forward. And then the final part of the book is there's 2 things going on at once with a couple of Jedi, and then the other thing that's going on at once is kind of like a big space battle. They're really cool, they're really interesting. I'm not going to go into any more detail aside from that because once again I don't want to spoil it. But there is one part of the book that I actually want to read out to you guys because it gives a really good insight into how the Jedi see the Force, and I just think it's a really cool thing. So it's about halfway through the book, and well, actually no, it's about a third of the way through the book, so I'm just going to read out a small passage, and that's probably going to be the end of this, because as I said, I don't want to say too much else about the books and things, because I really want to encourage people to go out and check out this book. It is fantastic, honestly. I like a lot of Star Wars books, some are better than others. I think the Aftermath trilogy has some of the best story, but a lot of people have criticised Chuck Wendig's writing. I personally didn't have a problem with that, but I've heard a lot of people talk about it. Whereas like the Ahsoka book, the writing's great and it's fun, but the plot doesn't really go that far into things. It's only over a short period of time. And there's certain moments that are really, really interesting from Ahsoka's point of view and things. But you read it and it just kind of feels like 1 or 2 episodes of Clone Wars, which is exactly what it kind of was, because it was kind of made using some of the scripts that was going to be used during Clone Wars and things. So, there's that. I talk about Claudia Gray's books. I really like them. I think they're all excellent of the ones I've read. Princess Leia of Alderaan, that's a brilliant book. But obviously it just gives a lot more character hyper-focusing to Leia. Bloodline is hyper-focusing on Leia after the events of Return of the Jedi, but before The Force Awakens. I think that's about 20 or so years after The Force Awakens. After Return of the Jedi. I think it's like 10 or so years before The Force Awakens. Thereabouts. Maybe it's like 5 years before. So there's lots of bits and pieces here that are direct connections to other characters. The Light of the Jedi introduces a whole slew of new characters, both protagonists and antagonists, and I just think the way it's done is excellent. So I'm just going to read this little portion of the book. So this is all happening while the Great Disaster is going on, and it's from the point of view of Avar Kriss. She is that Jedi who can combine the minds of Jedi, essentially, and be able to connect them in special ways. So I'm just going to read out about a page or so of this, because I just think it's brilliant. So she's just got her lightsaber out. The lightsaber ignited with a snap and a hiss. A bright green beam speared straight up at the blue sky and illuminated the field of blue grain around her. The weapon began to rotate, slowly, like a blade of a windmill. It made a sound as it moved through the air, a low, droning hum. Avar breathed, in, out, and the blade slowly sped up. The tone of its passage through the air changed, no longer a low drone but a higher pitch, a lovely round note. The lightsaber moved faster, its blade now too fast to see, a green circle of light with a shining metallic centre. It was beautiful, but Avar closed her eyes. She did not need to see, she needed to hear. Her lightsaber was not just a weapon. Here, now, it was an instrument. The note of the blade rose, becoming a clear ringing, the normal crackling hum and whine of a lightsaber in combat replaced by a pure, glass-eyed tone. Her awareness was the song of the saber, and she tuned the speed of its rotation until the note it produced was precisely in sync with, yes, Avar thought, I hear it. Her mind snapped outward, with the saber song chiming in harmony with the larger chorus of the Force, in a single instant becoming the entire system and everything within it, and more particularly, every single Jedi, each connected to the Force in their own way. What she heard as a song, Elzar Mann saw as a deep, endless, storm-tossed sea. The Wookiee, Buryaga, was a single leaf on a gigantic tree with deep-dug roots and sky-high limbs. Douglas Sunvale saw the Force as a huge interlocked set of gears, made of an endless variety of materials from crystal to bone. Bail Zettifar danced with fire. Loden Greatstorm danced with the wind. This was not the simple network she had built earlier. This was deeper. All of the Jedi were the Force, and the Force was all of them, and she, Avar Kriss, could touch them all, no matter how they saw the Force. So that's the bit I just want to read out. That doesn't spoil any part of the book, but obviously if anyone wanted to go in the book without hearing anything else about it, there you go. So I just think that is a really good interpretation of the Force and how everyone sees it differently and perceives it. And I think that passage, which as I said was about a page, is just such a beautiful way, if anyone hasn't read the book, to kind of should be enough to convince you to read it. The writing is excellent, the characters are amazing, the plot is fantastic, and I can't wait for more High Republic content, and I'm just excited to be able to finish recording this so I can go and start reading Claudia Gray's Into the Dark book, because, Charles Soule is my favourite comic author. This book, if he writes another one, he may become my favourite book author, but at present, Claudia Gray still has that crown because she has written 4 top-tier Star Wars books, and I'm going to start reading the 5th one. So yeah, I hope that gives you guys a nice insight into the High Republic as a whole, as well as the Light of the Jedi book in itself. I really hope you guys enjoyed this book review. Please tell me what you thought about it. I got some really positive feedback for the Master and Apprentice book, and I hope that you guys sort of appreciate this as well in a similar way. Obviously, I did it slightly differently, but it still works, and it's a lot of fun just to be able to talk about this for an hour, because Lord knows Megan doesn't want to hear me talking about this book for an hour. I've already spoken to her far too much about it. But yeah, please let me know what you guys think. If any of you do pick up the High Republic comics, either Adventures or the standard one, or if you do read this book, or Claudia Gray's, or Justina Ireland's, or if you're listening to this further down the line when some of the other content is out, please let me know what you think of this review and what you think of the High Republic in general. I'm a massive Star Wars fan, so it was going to be quite difficult for me to not enjoy this, because I just wanted some new exciting content. But for anyone who is less of an intense fan than myself, I'd be really interested to hear what you think, both of this review and also of any of the content that you've consumed yourselves. So yeah, guys, that is about it. I'm not going to waffle on anymore here. Normally, my other things I talk about previous episodes and other stuff and blah, blah, blah. The next episode is just going to be the next edition of the main run of Star Wars comics on the feed of Star Wars Comics in Canon, which is obviously on the feed of Comics in Motion. I think by now on YouTube, I'm almost up to date with uploading these, they've been a bit of a backlog, but they should be on there as well. So if you're listening on YouTube, hello. If you're listening on the feed of Comics in Motion, go check out all the other amazing shows on Comics in Motion, because it is just such a pleasure to be a part of that great family, because that's what it is. Yeah, that's about it for me, guys. I don't really know how to end this. It's a weird, waffly end to a weird book review that's a little bit different to the standard. So I appreciate every one of you guys listening, especially all the way to the end here. Really hope it doesn't ruin the book for you, but I tried to give you enough detail that it wouldn't. And yeah, speak to you guys next week. And as always, may the Force be with you.